My wife was in disbelief when I sneaked into her and her boss's dinner. I told her that she had ended everything, including her boss's company. I divorced her that same night, and the next day she had a shocking surprise at work. And it was right there, standing at the entrance to that restaurant that was too expensive for the salary she said her boss couldn't afford, that I knew that the pain had finally stopped being a shadow and had become a knife. The maitre d' looked at me twice before he was convinced that I wasn't lost. I said the name of the reservation, his name, and the employee's smile froze for a second. He knew. Of course he knew. Everyone knew, except me. I walked with calculated steps, breathing deeply as if entering an open grave, as if burying the last bit of naivety that remained. And when I saw her, laughing with the napkin between her fingers, her head tilted slightly as she always did when she was seducing, the expensive wine in her glass, the same wine she refused at home saying it was too strong for her, I knew that the woman standing there was not my wife. Not anymore. Her smile stopped as soon as she saw me. Her fork stopped in midair. Her eyes sought refuge in any corner of the room. I approached her with the calm of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I just whispered that she had destroyed everything. And more than our marriage, more than our home or what we pretended was still love, she had destroyed her lover's company. His career. The reputation that they both tried to hide under the sheets. And right there, under the dim light and the background music, I declared my divorce as if delivering the final sentence to a defendant who hadn't even bothered to pretend innocence. She tried to speak, tried to reach for my arm, but I no longer belonged to that world where she could touch me and dismantle me. I left, leaving behind two half-full glasses, a woman in ruins and a man with his mouth half open who still had no idea what awaited him the next morning. Betrayal, contrary to what they say, doesn't tear you apart all at once. It cuts you slowly, silently. It starts with small absences, careless touches, glances that look away too quickly. It starts with a cell phone turned upside down, with a meeting that ends too late, with a new perfume that she says she got from a colleague, but that I've never seen on any of her friends' shelves. And then you start to suspect, but you refuse to accept it, because admitting the truth would mean giving up the comfortable fantasy you've built with so much effort. You watch her sleep and wonder if that face resting next to you is the same one that smiles in messages that aren't yours. You remember the times when she said she was too tired to talk and you wonder if she used that same argument with him. You torture yourself because you want proof, you want certainties, but you're afraid to find them. Until one day you find them. And nothing is the same again. But what she didn't know, what neither of us knew, is that I was already ahead of them. That while she was practicing fake smiles and encrypted messages, I was silently moving pieces. That while she was deleting conversations and typing lies, I was gathering evidence, transferring shares, reorganizing contracts. They thought they were living a soap opera romance, but they were just participating in a bigger plan. A plan that I began to draw up the day I learned that she was lying to me with her eyes open. That she was saying, "I love you," while she was still marked by another man's fingers. She didn't know it, but I lost her long before I betrayed her back with the truth. I knew who he was. He knew what it depended on, where the influence came from that kept her position untouchable. He knew about the trips that the two hid under the pretext of conferences and leadership courses. I found out her favorite restaurant, the hotel they were staying at, the fake name she used on reservations. I found out that her boss was married to the daughter of one of the company's biggest investors. And that's when I decided where to attack. Because pain for pain, I would make them remember mine. Because no one steals someone's heart without paying high interest. The morning after dinner, she arrived at work with light makeup on, as if trying to erase the traces of the night before. But the smile she was still practicing in the mirror faded when the company security guards called her by her last name and asked her to hand over her badge. She tried to ask why, but they just said that management required confidentiality. She was taken to the legal room. There, they sat her down in front of a screen that displayed a presentation with photos, emails, statements, videos. The betrayal was no longer a secret. It was a dossier. And at that moment, it wasn't the wife who saw her life fall apart, it was the professional, the woman who always said she would never depend on any man. What she didn't know was that the man she betrayed was the one who supported the castle where she slept with another man. She cried. She tried to explain. She tried to blame her boss, saying she was manipulated, that she felt fragile, needy. That the marriage was cold, that things had gotten lost along the way. But no one listened. Because by then, her reputation was already torn. The company's shares had plummeted. The investor's daughter demanded her lover's head. The lover was fired in a scandal, sued for misconduct and improper relationships. And she, well, she was officially dismissed with the stamp that no one wants on their resume, involvement with superiors in the workplace, with a direct impact on the company's decisions. From one day to the next, what was desire turned into contempt. What was status turned into shame. And her name stopped opening doors. She tried to look for me. She sent messages. She called. She showed up at my house with swollen eyes and a broken voice. She asked for forgiveness. She said she made a mistake. That she realized too late how much she loved me. That she now knew I was the only one. That she just wanted a chance to rebuild. That losing everything made her understand what really mattered. I listened. In silence. I let her say everything. Then I got up, went to the door and told her that she had come too late. That the love she killed, I had already buried. And that in the grave where she planted betrayal, something new was born in me, freedom. She didn't expect it. She thought I would be broken, waiting for a touch, a word to bring me back. But what she saw was a man who had already moved on. Someone who, while she was clinging to the past, was already living a new future. She cried. She begged. But there was no more room for us. There was no more us. Only the consequences. The most curious thing of all is that, weeks later, at a corporate event, I was introduced to someone. Someone who looked at me calmly, who listened to my story without judging, who didn't try to fix anything, just was there. And perhaps, at that moment, I understood that love does not die, it hides, waiting for us to find ourselves in it again, in another body, with another soul. And that's when I knew, that story of betrayal wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the best part of my life. But what she discovered months later, that was the twist that no one expected. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of cheating. All stories are fictional, but inspired by real situations to show how infidelity is capable of destroying homes, families, and entire lives. Our goal is clear, to expose the consequences of betrayal with strong and emotional narratives. Get ready now, you're about to hear a story shocking. It was an elegant but not over-the-top house, with modern lines, glass walls and exposed concrete, surrounded by tall trees and a well-kept garden. The kind of place that exudes balance, as if every decor choice was made with purpose, and not just for aesthetics. Daniel and Elena lived in that house, a couple who seemed, in everyone's eyes, to have beaten the statistics. 17 years of marriage, a teenage daughter who grew up with a sparkle in her eyes and a Labrador puppy who filled the afternoons with barks of joy. Daniel was a founding partner of an international impact consultancy, one of those companies that move large sums without fanfare, working behind the scenes for large conglomerates. Elena, a communications graduate, had followed a stable professional path, growing up in a corporation where her charisma and intelligence made her rise quickly. She was seen as competent, refined, and inspiring to the younger women who entered the company wanting to be like her. Daniel had always been a methodical man, the kind who preferred order to improvisation, who double-checked before leaving the house to see if the alarm had been activated. Discreet, intense, with a sensitivity hidden behind objective gestures. There was something about him that conveyed security, perhaps his steady eyes, or perhaps the way he always put himself in the background when others spoke. His silence was never empty, but full of listening. He loved Elena with an intensity that only those who have been shaped by absence know how to love. He had grown up with an absent father and an overworked mother, and he had promised himself that when he had his own family, he would be there for her, every day. And so it was. He made breakfast while Elena got ready, picked up his daughter from school whenever he could, wrote little notes that he left among her books, and on their wedding anniversaries, he never repeated the same type of celebration. One day it was a dinner for two in an unusual place, the next, a handwritten letter with memories of the past year. Elena was different. Vibrant, spontaneous, with a smile that spread throughout the room. Her intelligence was her main weapon, but also her armor. She built her independence with determination, fighting against what was expected of her and making space where many thought she was small. She admired Daniel deeply. The respect between them was visible even in the silences. There was complicity, touches that didn't need words, glances exchanged at parties where they knew exactly what the other was thinking. Elena trusted Daniel more than she trusted anyone in the world. And Daniel, in turn, never doubted his wife. They were a team. A couple who discussed plans together, who didn't make important decisions without consulting each other. The relationship was stable, yes, but with passion still pulsing, although in a more mature, less impulsive way, with the intensity of someone who built intimacy over time, brick by brick. They had well-established routines, but they weren't monotonous. Fridays were sacred to them, sometimes dinner at home with wine and conversation, sometimes a movie followed by dessert at some hidden cafe that she loved. On Sundays, they would walk together in the morning with their dog and discuss everything, politics, TV shows, their daughter's future, or even everyday nonsense. People who knew them said they looked like those movie couples who grow old together holding hands, and perhaps that was the image that sustained them on their more ordinary days, the belief that they had found something too rare to risk. Daniel used to say that the secret to their success was knowing how to look at each other even after the years. He noticed when Elena changed her haircut, noticed the tiredness on her face before she even said it, bought books that he thought she would like and left them by her bed. Elena, in turn, knew when Daniel needed silence, when a hug said more than advice. They respected each other even when it came to limits. They never imposed themselves on each other. And that was what made friends and family look to them as an example. She often said that her marriage was her anchor, and that if she hadn't had Daniel by her side, she might have lost herself amidst her ambition and the frenetic pace of work. At the company where Elena worked, she had achieved a leadership position that required constant presence, but also gave her a certain prestige. She was respected and listened to. Frequently invited to corporate events and dinners, she was seen as a bridge between generations and sectors. Always very well dressed, with sober elegance and calculated smiles, she moved among her colleagues like someone who knew exactly where she stood. Daniel enjoyed watching her grow, he was proud of her and made a point of showing it. At home, he spoke enthusiastically about her projects, and sometimes his daughter would hear him repeat that Elena was the most brilliant woman he had ever met. In the social circles they frequented, they both maintained impeccable postures. Elena was charming and engaging. Daniel was discreet and polite. Together, they balanced each other like two sides of a perfectly adjusted scale. Dinners at home were carefully planned events, with menus lined up, dimmed lights and background music. There was a feeling that everything had been carefully planned, that the couple knew what they wanted and, more than that, had achieved what they wanted. And although not everything was rosy, as in any real relationship, they knew how to overcome friction with elegance. When they argued, it was with arguments, not shouting. When they disagreed, they knew how to listen to each other before walking away. The daughter, Sophia, 14 years old, was a reflection of this balance. Intelligent, observant, affectionate. She loved spending time with her parents, but she also knew they needed space together. Sometimes I would pretend to be busy just so they could have a moment alone. She was a sensitive girl and very close to her mother. They talked like friends and, with Daniel, they had a relationship of deep admiration. She listened to his advice with respect and called him my best friend when talking to schoolmates. At first glance, the couple's life seemed immune to wear and tear. And perhaps that's why no one paid attention to the small signs that were beginning to appear. A delay in responding to a message, a sudden change in the way she dressed for company events, a longer absence than usual after corporate meetings. But Daniel was not a man to harbor paranoia. He trusted. And his trust came not from naivety, but from the conviction that true love hides no shadows. He preferred to believe in what he had built with her than in ghosts that might not even exist. Until then, this faith seemed enough. The days went by. Family lunches, birthdays celebrated with simple but meaningful cakes, short trips during long weekends, souvenirs on social media with loving captions. Everything seemed to continue as normal. Daniel continued to take care of everything with delicacy, the investments, the reserves, the plans for his daughter's future, and even the renovation of the garden that Elena wanted so much. He was always attentive, present, willing. A man who still saw beauty in every feature of his wife's face, even when she was exhausted or distant. And she, in turn, continued to move naturally in her routine, maintaining a sweet tone at home, distributing attention when she could, and preserving that look of someone who says, "Everything is fine." But there was a subtle difference in the silences between them now. An almost imperceptible noise in the midst of the spoken words. As if something was trying to infiltrate between the cracks in the life they had so carefully assembled. The city continued to move, the days passed with their predictable routines, and the world spun as it always had. But in that house, where everything still seemed in its proper place, there was something beginning to shift, slowly, invisibly. And no one, absolutely no one, could predict where it would end up. Because behind every seemingly perfect story, there is always an unseen detail, an ununderstood gesture, a choice made in silence. And when the truth finally finds its way, not everyone will be prepared for what it brings with it. The second half of that year brought subtle but cumulative changes. Elena seemed more absent, involved in after-hours meetings, impromptu events, and short trips that came up out of nowhere. Daniel, accustomed to his wife's busy schedule, didn't question it. There was an implicit agreement between them to respect each other's careers. He continued his routine calmly, taking care of the house, their daughter, and the details that sustained the family structure. But inside him, something began to move, a silent sensation, like a shadow growing on the edges of his gaze. There was no proof, only instincts, but Daniel was not one to follow impulses. Still, for the first time in years, he began to observe Elena's gestures with a gaze that was not just one of admiration, but of analysis. He noticed how she got ready before events, her new perfumes, the smiles she no longer gave at home but seemed to save for elsewhere. Sophia noticed it too. One night, she asked her mother if she was happy, if her work wasn't demanding too much. Elena smiled and said she was just tired, that the projects had been demanding too much emotionally, but that everything was fine. And maybe she believed that. Or maybe she wanted to believe it. There was a conflict inside her that not even she fully understood, a whirlwind between the woman who built that family with love and the woman who, silently, was beginning to break away from everything she had defended for so long. But she didn't talk about it. Not to Daniel, not to her friends, not to herself. She just kept going. At the company, a new expansion project had brought Elena closer to Ricardo, one of the organization's most influential directors. He was a charismatic, confident man, with experience in international negotiations and a captivating way of speaking. With him, Elena felt intellectually challenged, provoked, seen. Little by little, they began to work together on presentations, strategies, and trips. He praised her mind and her ideas, and told her she should go further. During one of these meetings outside the office, their gazes lingered longer than they should have. A touch on the hand, a knowing smile, a dinner that went on for longer than was acceptable. And then, without a plan, without rehearsal, it happened. The first night. She didn't consider it a betrayal to herself. She preferred to call it a slip-up. A moment of weakness, an emotional turmoil caused by stress. She told herself it wouldn't happen again. That it had no meaning. And the next day, she went home with flowers for Daniel and a cake for Sophia, trying to silence her guilt with gestures. But it didn't stop. The encounters continued, hidden between work commitments and evening events. Elena began to create more elaborate excuses, to avoid eye contact when she lied, to get irritated by simple questions. Daniel, attentive to details, began to notice the flaws. A different perfume that she said was a sample from the company, a blouse with a new button that he had never seen, a message that appeared on her cell phone screen with a generic name, but that made her pale when she read it. Still, he didn't confront her. Not out of fear of the answer, but out of respect for what they had experienced. He needed to be sure before destroying with words what still, in some way, existed. The following weeks were an exercise in control. Daniel began to record schedules, check calendars, and observe patterns. He followed Elena's every step from a distance. He never hacked into her cell phone, never broke her trust with impulsive actions. He just observed. One day, he decided to show up unexpectedly at one of her company's corporate events. He said he wanted to see a presentation she had been talking about so much, and that they could go out for dinner afterwards. Elena hesitated. She said it wasn't an open event, that there wouldn't be any guests. But Daniel insisted gently, without accusing her. She eventually gave in. He went. He stood in the audience, in silence. And he saw how they looked at each other. How she smiled at Ricardo with a glow he no longer saw at home. And that was enough to ignite something inside him. It was no longer doubt. It was pain. That night, Elena tried to make up for it with sweet words, compliments, and superficial touches. But Daniel no longer reacted as he had before. There was a chasm between them, and she felt it, even if she didn't want to name it. Sex became rarer. Conversations became more formal. Breakfasts were shared in silence, nights spent on opposite sides of the bed. She said it was tiredness. He just nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't seek more. And that was what worried her the most. Because behind Daniel's calm, there was a storm. And she knew it. Deep down, she knew that something had changed. That he was seeing. That he was waiting for the right moment. Ricardo, on the other hand, was stepping up their meetings. He started sending messages at odd hours, inviting her to short business trips, and praising not only her professional performance, but also the woman behind it. Elena felt torn. She didn't want to give up her family, but she also didn't know how to cut off what had become more than just physical. One weekend, Daniel suggested a trip for the two of them, just the two of them. He said he wanted to reconnect. Elena declined, claiming that she had important company training. In reality, she was going to spend the weekend at a resort with Ricardo, under the pretext of a strategic planning immersion. That was when Daniel knew for sure. He didn't stop her. He helped her pack. He wished her luck. He told her they would be fine. But as soon as she left, he took action. He called an old friend who was a corporate intelligence specialist. He didn't ask for invasive surveillance. Just location information, public records, discrete images. In 2 days, he had enough. Times that matched his, reservations in disguised names, hotel check-in records she never mentioned. He didn't show them to anyone. He kept everything. Because, more than confronting her, he needed to understand how far this was going. And, most importantly, why. Elena returned from the trip feeling lighter, smiling like she hadn't smiled in a long time. He talked about goals, results, how the company was growing. Daniel listened, praised, made her favorite dinner. He spent the next few days as if nothing had happened. But at night, in silence, I read and reread the reports, watched the images. Ricardo's face, his hands on his wife, the way she let herself be touched. And that tore apart every memory they had together. There was no more room for doubt. The betrayal was blatant. And yet, he waited. It was then that she received an invitation to a corporate dinner at Elena's company. A get-together with leaders and strategic guests. She was surprised when he said he would go. She tried to hide her discomfort. She said she would be busy with her colleagues and that she might not be able to pay attention. But he insisted. He said he wanted to see her in action, to show her support. And he did. He arrived early. He looked around the room, greeted acquaintances, and sat near the center. And then, when Elena walked in with Ricardo, arm in arm, smiling as if they were just co-workers, Daniel stood up. He walked over to them with calm, firm steps and stopped in front of them. Elena's expression fell in seconds. Her smile faded. Her eyes widened. Ricardo tried to maintain his posture, but the tension was visible. Daniel stared at them for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. And then, in a firm voice, he said that she was done with everything. With the marriage. With the trust. With the professional life of the man by her side. And that this would be the last time she would see them together. Because that night, he would ask for a divorce. And the next day, she would have a surprise that would completely change everything she thought she controlled. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse her. He just turned and left. The next morning, Elena woke up to notifications, messages, and an urgent summons from the board. Upon arriving at the company, she was taken to the room where the reality she had avoided facing for so long awaited her, ready to dismantle the castle she had built with lies. And what she discovered there, was still just beginning. The office was silent, cold, the air conditioning seemed to blow directly into Elena's soul as she sat in front of the board, her eyes trying to comprehend what was unfolding in front of her. One of the oldest members of the board, a man with a closed expression and a clinical look, was slowly twirling a pen between his fingers, as if he were about to pronounce a sentence. She didn't know what was coming yet, but something inside her had already been affected. Ever since dinner, ever since Daniel had appeared like a specter of her own consciousness, she had known that the stability she had pretended to maintain was in ruins. She tried to maintain control, her composure, straightening her posture in the chair, even though her stomach seemed to be doing flips and cold sweat was running discreetly down her silk blouse. The company's president, a reserved, clinical man with decades of experience dealing with internal disasters, opened a folder in front of her. There were photos, reports, printed messages, screenshots. Elena couldn't see the details, but she recognized the outlines of her own tragedy. Her breath caught as he spoke her full name and announced that, effective immediately, she would be officially removed from all duties until the internal investigation was complete. Her eyes widened, she tried to say something, but was firmly interrupted. It was no longer time to justify herself. His voice continued, with professional coolness, informing her that the company had been notified by a major shareholder about possible conflicts of interest and inappropriate relationships that directly affected recent strategic decisions. But that wasn't what crushed her. It was the next sentence. The director said that the information had come from a dossier delivered directly to the wife of the majority investor. Elena blinked several times, trying to understand the connection. Until he said the name that froze her spine, Daniel. The dossier had been prepared months in advance and delivered by him, with proof that the man she had been having an affair with was, in fact, married to the only daughter of the company's controlling shareholder. And that, upon learning of the betrayal, his wife, direct heir to the family's wealth, had demanded the immediate removal of her husband and anyone associated with the scandal, including Elena. Elena's heart raced, the world spun around her, and a bitter nausea rose in her throat. She tried to say that she didn't know, that she had never been informed about Ricardo's marital status, that she would never have gotten involved if she had known about the family connections. But the room remained silent, as if everyone there had already formed their own opinion. The president simply replied that, even if it were true, ignorance did not exempt her from responsibility for having brought the company to the brink of a reputational collapse. He said that shares were being sold at an alarming rate, that the press already suspected the scandal, and that her name was too involved to be ignored. There would be audits, emergency meetings with shareholders, and the legal department had already been called. It was now a matter of institutional survival. She felt her legs weaken as she stood up, supported by one of the coordinators. The company corridors, once familiar, now seemed like an exit tunnel. Curious eyes followed her, disguised behind screens, muffled whispers filled the spaces between the rooms. She got into the elevator and went down alone, without looking at anyone, hugging her bag to her body as if it were armor. On the ground floor, when she got out, she didn't see any company car. The driver wasn't there. She walked to the street and hailed a taxi with trembling hands. She needed to go home. She needed to understand how Daniel knew. How he found out, how he approached Ricardo's wife, how he set it all up without her noticing. And, most importantly, why. When she entered the house, she found silence. Sophia was at school. Daniel had left no clues as to where he was. She sat on the couch and stared at the coffee table as if something there would answer the questions that were eating her up inside. The hours passed slowly. The phone rang once, twice, but she didn't answer. Notifications popped up on her phone, messages from colleagues, the press, unknown numbers. The scandal had already started to circulate. And all she could think was, he knew. He had known all along. And now she needed to see him. Look him in the eyes. Ask for answers, forgiveness, or just kneel before the dignity she herself had destroyed. It was at night, without tears, that he appeared. He entered silently, with the serene expression of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Elena ran to him, tried to hug him, but he pulled away slightly. There was no longer any warmth in the way he looked at her. They sat facing each other in the kitchen, where they had so often shared dinners, laughter, and dreams. She began to talk, to beg, to try to explain. She said it had been a mistake, that she had never meant to hurt him, that things had taken on proportions that she could not control. Daniel listened to everything in silence. He waited for her to finish. And then, in a firm voice, he asked if she knew the name of Ricardo's wife. Elena hesitated. She said no. That they had never mentioned it. Daniel pulled a small photo from his pocket. It was a simple image of an elegant woman holding a glass of wine at a party, surrounded by other guests. He placed it on the table. Elena stared at it, uncomprehending, until the memory hit her like a blade. She recognized the dress, the setting, the occasion. This woman had passed by her at one of the company events, had exchanged a brief greeting, a formal smile. She had never known who she was. Now she knew. It was her. The daughter of the man who supported the company. Ricardo's wife. And Daniel was standing next to her in the photo. Elena looked at her husband, confused. He then explained that he had discovered everything weeks before, and that, when investigating Ricardo's past, he understood that he was not just a co-worker. He was a man married to the main shareholder of the company where Elena worked. A man who used the power he had within the company to seduce, manipulate and expand his territory. Daniel not only discovered it, but he acted. He approached his wife, handed over the evidence, and together, they sewed together the downfall that she was now experiencing. Every move had been thought out. Every piece had been positioned. Because, for him, it was not enough to just walk away. He needed her to understand what she had done. Not only to him, but to her own life. Elena put her hand over her mouth, tears coming back strong. She said she didn't know, that she would never have gotten involved if she had known. Daniel calmly replied that betrayal was not just in the act, but in the daily choice to lie, to hide, to build another reality. He said she didn't need to have slept with anyone to break what they had. Silence was enough. And that now, she would live with the consequences. He didn't yell, he didn't rage. He just stood up, said he had already handed in the divorce papers, that the house would stay with her and their daughter, and that he would move on with his life. She tried to stop him, she cried, begged him to at least talk, to go to therapy, to try. But he just said he had already tried. And that her time was up. At the door, he turned around one last time. He said that soon, she would discover something she didn't know yet. And that this, yes, would change everything she still thought she could recover. Elena stood there, not understanding. What else could there be? What had not yet been revealed? The answer would come sooner than she imagined. And what she would discover, this time, there would be no going back. Elena spent the night awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, with her eyes fixed on the wall as if, by some miracle, time had gone back. His mind was spinning between memories and fragments of what he had heard from Daniel hours before. Everything seemed to be falling apart at a speed she could barely keep up with. The photo on the table, the name of the woman she had never even suspected was relevant, the fact that her husband not only knew about the betrayal, but had enough nerve to act strategically, to destroy with the same precision she had used to lie. He didn't explode, he didn't scream, he didn't beg. He simply dismantled his life with the calm of someone who learned not to react with anger, but with consequences. It hurt her in a way she couldn't name. It wasn't just regret. It was impotence. And worse, loneliness. For the first time in years, Elena felt like there was no one to turn to, not even herself. Dawn arrived without warning, the sun silently invading the room. She got up and looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't recognize herself. Her face was swollen, her eyes were sunken, her skin was dull. She tried to get ready, put on some clothes, hide the traces of a sleepless night. She had to pick up Sophia from school, give her a semblance of normality. When her daughter got into the car and noticed her mother's condition, she didn't ask anything. She just put on her headphones and looked out the window. The silence between them was like thick glass, translucent, but impenetrable. Elena wanted to say something, ask about her day, offer affection, but she couldn't find the words. They were far apart, and that hurt almost as much as everything that had happened before. When she got home, she found the door to Daniel's office ajar. On an unconscious impulse, she went in. There were few personal belongings there, but a brown envelope on the table caught her attention. It had her name handwritten on it. She opened it carefully, almost fearfully. Inside was a letter. Daniel explained, in a few pages, everything he had done in the last few weeks. The meetings with Ricardo's wife, the documents delivered to the company's board, the contact with lawyers, the purchase of shares on behalf of third parties to influence internal decisions. Each sentence was a cut, a new layer of pain. But it was the last part of the letter that made her hands tremble. Daniel revealed that, before starting the process of destroying Ricardo's public image, he had access to confidential documents that only the most trusted members of the company could obtain. Purchase and sale agreements, side negotiations and internal emails. And there, in the middle of all that corporate dirt, was Elena's name as an indirect witness, which could, in court, put her in the position of being complicit in the use of privileged information. She wasn't just being punished for a personal betrayal. She was being publicly positioned as a pawn in a dirty game involving power, money, and reputations. She fell to her knees. What had once seemed like a marital crisis was now reaching proportions she had never imagined facing. Her career, built with so much effort, was compromised in an almost irreversible way. Everything she had as a professional image was collapsing. This was not just emotional revenge. It was a meticulous execution, with surgical coldness. Daniel had planned every step. And for some reason, not yet explained, he wanted her to see everything before he completely collapsed. He wanted her to know that every gesture was calculated to give back exactly what she had taken away. Trust, peace, respect, security. At the end of the day, Elena decided to look for Ricardo. She needed to understand what else had been left out. She called several times, without success. She sent short messages, with no response. She knew where he lived, she had only been there a few times, but enough to remember the way. She got in her car and went to the condominium. At the gate, she was stopped. The doorman politely informed her that Mr. Ricardo was prohibited from receiving unauthorized visitors. She insisted, saying it was an urgent matter, but the employee simply said that his wife had left clear orders. Hearing that, Elena felt goosebumps on her skin. The siege was on. No one would talk to her, no one wanted to associate her name. She then decided to go to Daniel's old office. She knew he had stopped working for the company after selling the business, but perhaps he had left a trail, or someone who could tell her where he was. When she arrived, she found only a replacement secretary, who said that Daniel had stopped by a few days ago to pick up some documents, but had not left a new address. She said he had mentioned something about traveling, looking to start over, far away from there. Elena felt the ground slip away from her. He was no longer accessible. He had done what he needed to do and disappeared. And she didn't know what to do. He returned home and found Sophia sitting in the living room, staring at the switched-off television. The daughter, who had always been close, now barely looked at her. Elena sat next to him and tried to make conversation. Sophia didn't answer right away, but after a long silence, she just said that her father had called and that she was fine. He asked if he would come back. Elena replied in a low voice, saying that she didn't know. The daughter then turned her face, looked deep into her mother's eyes and said that she no longer recognized who she was. That was a sharp blow. More than any accusation or trial. It was confirmation that, by betraying Daniel, she betrayed more than one husband. She betrayed the image her daughter had of her. He betrayed the entire family. In the days that followed, the local press began reporting the downfall of two big names in the executive sector. Ricardo appeared to be the main person involved, and Elena was mentioned as part of the scandal, even if indirectly. The company issued an official statement about internal investigations and the removal of all those involved. Elena's home became an emotional prison. With each unanswered call, each door that did not open, she understood that her exile had begun. Her presence was uncomfortable even in her own social circles. Groups of friends fell silent. Invitations disappeared. Everything became silent. A week later, finally, a letter arrived in her mailbox. The sender was Daniel. The envelope was light. Inside was just a short note and a key. His handwriting was still firm, familiar. On the paper, he wrote that he had left something for her to see. One last thing. An address written underneath. Nothing else. She got in her car and drove to the place indicated. It was an old building, with discreet architecture. She climbed the steps as if she were walking to a trial. On the third floor, the door was marked with the number corresponding to the key. She opened it slowly. The room was empty, except for a single folder on the table. Inside were photos, contracts, proof of purchase. Here was the true climax of Daniel's plan. During the months he spent investigating the affair, he not only exposed Elena and Ricardo's scandal. He also quietly bought a significant portion of her company's shares held by discreet investors. And after his lover's downfall and Elena's departure, Daniel had taken over a majority stake in the company through a holding company. He was now the new controller. And at the bottom of the last document, a handwritten note: "You didn't just destroy our marriage. You destroyed what I built for the two of us. But I rebuilt it. Without you." Elena read it over and over again. The coldness, the pain, the precision. There was no more room for doubt. Daniel didn't just move on. He turned all the pain into movement. He didn't stand still. He didn't freeze. He moved forward. And now, there was no turning back. She dropped the papers on the table, looked around the empty room and felt, for the first time, the truth sink into her chest. She was no longer part of the story. There was no future to win back. There was no forgiveness waiting for time. There was only her, alone, facing her own choices. And the silence that remained, was irreversible. The folder remained open on the table, the papers scattered like fragments of a life that no longer belonged to him. Elena sat motionless, as if her body no longer responded to the urge to get up or run away. Everything around her seemed suspended, as if time refused to move forward and left her trapped in that unknown room, surrounded by documents that narrated with surgical precision the outcome of her own ruin. Every line of the contracts, every cold, objective signature, screamed Daniel's name, but not as the man she had loved, but as someone who had transcended the pain of betrayal to become a version of himself she never anticipated. There was the outcome of a story built in silence, nurtured by years of dedication, torn apart by months of lies and concluded with the kind of elegance that allows no appeal. She knew she had lost much more than a man. She lost the place she never imagined being expelled from, the heart of someone who loved her sincerely. When he finally gathered the strength to leave, night had already fallen and the streets were almost deserted. The sound of footsteps echoing on the sidewalk seemed louder than it should have been, and with every meter she walked, she felt smaller, unprotected, torn from a place where she believed she was untouchable. The ride home was silent. The house seemed even bigger, emptier, as if Daniel's absence had left a vacuum that swallowed everything around it. Sophia was in the room, and even without saying a word, her daughter knew that something new had happened. Elena didn't try to talk. I had nothing to say. I had lost the right to be heard. In the bathroom mirror, he stared into his own eyes with a coldness he never imagined he would carry. She was exhausted, but she knew she would have no rest. Because guilt, when it reaches the depths of the soul, does not allow rest. The days that followed were marked by a series of missed calls, ignored emails, and the growing certainty that her career was over. The press insisted on uncovering the behind-the-scenes details of the scandal, and her name appeared frequently, although without sufficient evidence to formally charge her. However, the damage to her reputation was irreversible. People close to her, who for years had called themselves friends, began to treat her like a stranger. Social invitations ceased. Even relatives avoided contact. The world around her closed its doors one by one, and Elena, isolated, began to question her own identity. Who was she now, without the professional admiration, without Daniel's love, without her daughter's respect? She tried, in an almost desperate impulse, to seek help. She contacted a therapist recommended by a former colleague. In the first sessions, she could barely speak. The words seemed to choke between wounded pride and irreversible shame. But little by little, she began to explore what had changed in her over the years. The therapist did not judge her. He just listened. And in one of these meetings, she finally verbalized what she had denied for so long, that she had lost herself in pride, in the need for validation, in the unconscious desire to prove that she was still desired, admired. That she had mistaken the gaze of a self-interested man for true love. That she had exchanged the solid ground of truth for the abyss of a seductive lie. And now there was no safety net. Sophia, watching everything from a distance, gradually began to change as well. The emotional distance did not turn into contempt, but rather into indifference. The girl matured prematurely, keeping her feelings to herself as if she could not trust anyone anymore. She began to avoid conversations, preferring to stay locked in her room or going out with friends without giving many details. Elena tried to get closer, to offer attention, to listen, but she ran into her daughter's silence as if she was facing a wall too high to climb. One night, she heard Sophia crying softly, but she did not have the courage to go into the room. She stayed outside, leaning against the door, with tears in her eyes, realizing that perhaps the most difficult reconquest of all would be hers. Daniel, on the other hand, had completely disappeared from everyday life. He didn't respond to emails or messages, and he didn't appear on social media. Some acquaintances said he was out of the country, working on new projects. Others mentioned that he had acquired a small company in a coastal city and was living there, discreetly. But nothing was confirmed. Elena looked for him in small clues, in random mentions, in faces that seemed to carry echoes of him. She didn't want to win him back, not anymore. She wanted to understand. To know if he still felt something. If he had left some space not for his return, but for understanding. However, his silence was absolute, which made everything even more cruel. Because when pain comes with absence, it echoes louder. A moral dilemma began to grow within her, like a question that haunted her in every moment of introspection: how far does justice go when it is confused with revenge? She knew she deserved consequences. I knew he cheated, he lied, he was selfish. But when he saw the scale of what had happened, the way Daniel had orchestrated each fall, he began to wonder if he was still the man he had known or if he had become something different. Because there was something ruthless in the perfection with which he executed the plan. One side of her recognized the pain that drove him. Another questioned whether it had been so necessary. Losing love was fair. But to lose everything? The career, the daughter, the peace? She had no answers. Just questions that ate away at her insides. The only certainty left was that he would never be who he was again. Not because I wanted to. But because now he knew, with every cell in his body, the price of his choices. I walked around the house and saw the framed portraits with different eyes. Every image of the happy family, of the spontaneous smiles, of the celebrated birthdays, now seemed like relics of an era that would never return. Sometimes, I would pick up my cell phone and open old conversations with Daniel, reread the messages, the everyday, I love yous, the inside jokes. And he wondered how he could have thrown everything away for a passing desire. The answer never came. Just silence. In the midst of all this deconstruction, an unexpected invitation arose. A charity event that, for some reason, still had his name on the list. Elena hesitated to go, but decided to attend. He needed to put himself before the world again. He dressed in sober attire, without exaggeration, and went. There, he found faces that avoided contact, but he also found one, just one, that smiled sincerely. It was a woman, unknown, who approached and said she knew his story. But, contrary to what I expected, it didn't come with judgment. He said he had also cheated. That he had lost everything. And it was rebuilding, slowly. He said that hell can be the place where something new is born, but that this only happens when everything is allowed to burn to the ground. Elena returned home with that phrase echoing in her mind. Maybe it was at that point. In the depths of hell itself. Where the ashes still smoke. Where there is nowhere to run, and no way to return. But where, perhaps, I could start walking again, even without direction. Because what Daniel took could not be rebuilt. But what was left, maybe it could be. And in the center of this void, of all the unanswered questions, of all the broken ties, a single doubt persisted with increasing force. Why had Daniel, after all, let her find that last key? Why had he not destroyed that too? Why had he allowed her to see, with her own eyes, the magnitude of the turnaround? Was it compassion? Pride? Or a final gesture of love, distorted by pain? That doubt, as cruel as everything that had happened, would become Elena's last companion, as the world around her slowly began to move on without her. And everything was heading towards something even greater. Something that no one, not even her, could have foreseen. The following weeks were marked by a different silence. Not the piercing silence of the first few days, but one that seemed closer to resignation, to the lukewarm acceptance that certain noises would never again fill that space. The house, once pulsating with voices, was now a sanctuary of static memories. Elena spent long hours alone, walking between rooms as if she could somehow reorganize the rubble of what had been her life. There were no more insistent notifications on her cell phone, nor phone calls from coworkers. The scandalous headlines had cooled, replaced by other, more recent public crises, and her name no longer provoked the same frenzy as before. But if the world seemed to have moved on, inside her the storm still raged with the force of a hurricane that refused to dissipate. She continued to try to understand not only what had happened, but what exactly inside her had allowed it all to become possible. Sophia had become increasingly distant. She followed her routines with almost mechanical precision. She would wake up early, get ready by herself, make her own coffee and go out with her headphones on, as if that were a barrier to the world. Elena watched everything from a distance, feeling less and less like a mother and more like a spectator of her daughter's life. She tried to get closer a few times, to suggest conversations, to offer advice, but she always came up against brief responses, restrained gestures, and averted glances. The bond between the two had become a tenuous thread, ready to snap at the slightest touch. On one of those occasions, when Elena was preparing dinner and Sophia went into the kitchen just to get a glass of water, she tried, once again, to start a conversation. "I know you're hurt, daughter, and you have reason to be. I just wanted you to know that I'm still here. Even when I make mistakes, even after everything." Sophia was silent for a few seconds, with the glass in her hand, before responding in a firm voice, but without raising her tone. "You always say you're still here. But what's the point, Mom, if what I need most isn't your presence, it's the person you were before everything?" The sentence landed like a punch in the chest. Elena felt short of breath for a second, but she didn't have the courage to retort. She just nodded weakly and watched her daughter leave through the kitchen door. She stood there, alone, in front of the still hot pan and the feeling that there was nothing left to serve at the table. In the midst of this domestic meltdown, an unexpected email message appeared. It was from a former college friend, now involved in a social education project in another state. The message said that she had heard about the scandal in the newspapers, but that instead of judging, she had thought of lending a hand. She said she needed someone with management experience, who knew how to deal with people, plan, and coordinate. It wouldn't be a salary worthy of executive positions, nor would it have glamour or prestige, but it would be a chance to do something meaningful. Elena read and reread the message dozens of times before responding. Not because she had any doubts about accepting, but because she didn't know if she was still capable of being useful in any way. 2 days later, she boarded a silent flight. She told almost no one. Sophia only knew that her mother would be away for a few days. In the new city, she was received discreetly and with a dose of care. The project was small, but full of life. Young people in vulnerable situations studying, dreaming, trying to create a different future. There, for the first time in months, Elena felt that she was being seen not as the woman in the scandal, but as someone who could help. The work was simple: organize donations, redesign internal processes, optimize the team's routine. And, curiously, that began to fill spaces that seemed irremediably empty. It wasn't redemption. It was just a breath of fresh air. It was in this environment that she met Lucas, one of the local coordinators. Unlike anything she had ever experienced, Lucas was calm, with a direct but gentle manner. He had marks on his face that revealed a life of personal struggles, but his eyes carried a calmness that Elena had not seen in a long time. He never asked about her past, and perhaps that was what captivated her the most. He just wanted to know who she was at that moment. They spent days exchanging ideas about the project, having lunch together, sharing small silences. And then, one night, while organizing boxes of teaching materials, Lucas said something that she would never forget. "You carry too much guilt. We don't need to drag ourselves over our mistakes our whole lives. Sometimes, making a mistake doesn't take away your right to start over. It just changes the path." That sentence echoed for days. And slowly, Elena began to look at herself with a little less fury. She began to accept that, although she could not erase the past, perhaps she could learn to live with it. Not as a burden, but as part of history. She allowed herself to laugh again, to feel pleasure in helping, to appreciate the silence without it hurting so much. But at the same time, she knew that there was still a chapter that needed to be faced. Sophia. When he returned, he found his daughter colder than before. As if the absence had reinforced the idea of abandonment. The next night, he sat on the sofa and called Sophia in a tone he hadn't used in a long time, firm, but sweet. The teenager came slowly, crossed her arms, and stood up. Elena then told us about the trip, about the project, about how much it made her feel alive again. He talked about guilt, about regret, about shame. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she couldn't stay silent any longer. Sophia listened to her in silence, and when her mother finished, she said only one thing: "I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. But I see that you're trying." And that was it. No hug, no immediate forgiveness. Just a crack. And in that small crack, Elena felt something blossom. Not hope. Not yet. But the beginning of a reconnection. A few days later, while walking in the park near her home, she spotted a familiar figure in the distance. She stopped, unsure whether to approach. But when the man turned his head and their eyes met, she knew. It was Daniel. He saw her too, but didn't react. He remained seated on the bench, reading a book, serene. Elena took a deep breath and approached. He greeted her with a subtle nod. She asked if she could sit down. He agreed. They both remained silent for a few moments, watching the lake, the leaves falling, the children playing. Until she asked him how he was. He answered simply, saying that he was fine. And that he was learning to live another life. A new life, simpler, more honest with himself. Elena, her voice breaking, said that she hadn't come to him to ask for anything. That she didn't expect anything in return, or understanding. But that she needed to thank him. Because if it weren't for the pain he caused, she wouldn't have discovered who she really was. That, even with all the suffering, that was the most honest act anyone could have done for her. Daniel listened in silence. Then he said something that completely disarmed her: "I didn't want to destroy you. I wanted you to understand how much you destroyed me. But now I just want you to be okay." Elena nodded, tears in her eyes. They stood there for a few more minutes, and then said goodbye. No promises, no future. Only with the certainty that that story, although it could not be rewritten, had finally found an end point. But what was yet to come, would come with enough force to transform everything one last time. Daniel left the park bench shortly after Elena left, walking with firm but unhurried steps. The brief encounter had ended a cycle that had long been too painful to be touched upon. He felt neither euphoria nor anger, only a feeling of decompression, as if removing a weight that had been pressing on his chest for years. For the first time, he felt that he could finally exist outside the shadow of that marriage. In the new life he had chosen, far from the spotlight and demands, he had found a way to breathe again. The small company he had bought on the coast, focused on sustainable projects, was already thriving. But more than the profits, it was the process that fulfilled him. The simple routine, the anonymous faces, the genuine conversations. People who knew him by name and not by history. He had allowed himself to start over, and in that space of reconstruction, he met Clara, an environmental engineer who got involved in the projects with a passion that reminded him of who he once was. Clara wasn't an immediate romantic new beginning, but over time, she became a constant presence. Unlike Elena, she didn't come from a world of appearances, and perhaps that's why Daniel was able to be himself. Before he knew it, he was already sharing mornings, lunches, and stories with her. It was with her that Daniel rediscovered the pleasure of the little things, calmly making coffee, walking barefoot on the sand, laughing about trivial matters. He didn't replace one love with another, he simply rediscovered the ability to love without fear. It was another life. And for him, it was enough. Elena, in turn, spent the following months immersed in trying to rebuild the bond with Sophia. The loopholes that the daughter offered were few and, at times, difficult to interpret. But she didn't back down. He learned to listen more and talk less, to accept that he had no control over the timing of forgiveness. The conversations were short, but they left traces. One night, as they watched a documentary together on the couch, Sophia leaned her head lightly on her mother's shoulder. He didn't say anything, nor did Elena comment. But that gesture was confirmation that something was being delicately rebuilt. The bond, still fragile, began to take shape. And that was more valuable to Elena than any position she had ever held. Far from corporate environments, he found purpose in social work. She regularly returned to the project where she had been welcomed, but now with new ideas, new proposals. She began offering workshops on work ethics and self-esteem, helping other women understand their own boundaries before they cross them. His words no longer came from the arrogance of someone who believes he has all the answers, but from the humility of someone who has almost lost everything. And, for that very reason, his words carried weight. That didn't erase the past, but it gave it new meaning. Ricardo, on the other hand, was not so lucky. The public downfall was only the beginning of his downfall. The lawsuit filed by his wife turned into a long and exhausting legal battle, culminating in the almost total loss of his assets and joint custody of his children. The company he worked for never recovered from the image crisis, and he began to be seen in the market as a walking risk. He tried to find a new job, but found doors closed. Bitter, isolated and financially broke, he lived with the weight of his own choices without the astuteness or emotional strength to start over. He became a shadow of the man he had been, incapable of recognizing responsibility for his own actions. The silence of his wife, who never agreed to talk to him after the scandal, was the final blow. There was no drama, no public confrontations. Just his definitive absence. Ricardo became a living warning to many executives who learned the hard way that there is no power sufficient to sustain an empire built on lies and vanity. Sophia, in turn, found a way to reframe the pain over time. He began to write, draw, and use art as an escape and expression. She joined a theater group at school and, there, discovered the power of telling stories, including her own. One night, he performed an original scene about disappointment and reconciliation, in which a daughter confronts an absent mother. Elena was in the audience and cried silently from beginning to end. At the end, when the daughter left the stage and their eyes met, there was a small wave, shy but genuine. For the first time since the fall, Elena felt that she was no longer just someone's mistake in history. He was slowly becoming part of the cure. One spring morning, Daniel discreetly returned to the city to sign pending documents related to the old company. He knew he might run into familiar faces, but he didn't worry. He walked with a different posture, a different look. As he left the notary's office, he was surprised by Sophia on the other side of the street. She saw him first. She ran towards him and hugged him tightly, surprising him. She said she missed him, that she had a lot to tell him, that she was writing a play. Daniel, moved, said he was proud of her. They arranged to have lunch. Elena wasn't there, and they both understood that it was better this way. The relationship between father and daughter began again there, with a naturalness that didn't require effort, only time. Daniel heard everything about school, drawings, theater, and left that meeting with the certainty that, despite everything, he had saved what was most important. Later that day, Sophia sent her mother a message with a photo of her father and a simple, "It was good. He's fine." Elena looked at the picture, tears in her eyes, and smiled. Not with happiness, but with sad gratitude. Knowing that Daniel was doing well was both a relief and a pain at the same time. But above all, it was fair. He deserved this new chapter. Months passed, and Elena no longer had the shame on her face. People still stared, some still judged, but she no longer gave in to it. She learned to live with the trail of what was, without letting it stop her from living what could be. In a talk to young people about choices and consequences, he said loud and clear that he had cheated, that he had lied, that he had lost everything. But he also said that after losing everything, he discovered what really had value. And at the end, she received a standing ovation. Because the truth, even naked, is stronger than any social makeup. Daniel and Clara followed together. Not a fairy tale romance, but a partnership built on sincerity, companionship and respect. They shared life with simplicity and truth, and that was all Daniel ever wanted. Sophia began to visit him frequently. He learned to see his father no longer as an infallible hero, but as a man who felt, fell, got up and knew how to forgive, even without coming back. Elena, alone, found peace. She no longer looked for Daniel, she did not try to reconquer what had ended. She understood that love, sometimes, does not end in tragedy or reconciliation. Sometimes, it ends in acceptance. And that, in itself, is already a form of redemption. Now that you've come this far, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments. We really want to hear what you think about each of these characters and the choices they made. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity to subscribe now. Every week we have shocking stories like this one, which show how much our choices shape our destinies. And remember, this channel will never support any type of betrayal. Here, we tell these stories to show how much it can destroy homes, lives and reputations. Until the next story.